What's going on, everyone? It's Chef, and welcome to episode 3 of the Dark Souls 3 build series. Bleed builds have always been one of the coolest build archetypes to me. Speedily ramping up bleed procs on bosses is super satisfying and oftentimes effective too. All the weapons just have an intimidating aesthetic that makes for really cool looking bases for builds, and the idea of bringing that into the arena sounds like a ton of fun in theory. However, in practice, bleed isn't really so great in PvP. While it might be the strongest status effect type build to use, it honestly doesn't have much to compete against when it comes to frostbite and poison. Now, is this the strongest build I could come up with? Absolutely not. I know there are some pretty strong ones out there, so if you're looking for optimal, this is not the way, but it's what I thought was a unique setup and one that would be a bunch of fun to play around with for a video. Took me a little longer to get some nice clips for a video compared to the last 2 episodes because of how many times I pressed the lose button, but hey, fun is fun. And welcome back. I try to make the montage in a way that's highly edited and fun to watch, while also trying to show off how the build really works with some fuller length clips. Let me know if you think I'm at a good or bad balance between the two. For equipment, there are 2 key elements of the build, being a bleed Barbed Straightsword and a bleed Bonewheel Shield. Rings come down to personal preference like usual, but I chose to go with Ring of Favor, Chloranthy, Prisoner's Chain, and Life Ring. Armor is arbitrary of course, but if you want to imitate the look, I'm using the Silver Mask, Dark Armor, Desert Pyromancer Gloves, and Dark Leggings. Shiv is something I always pack with my builds for finishing people that use tiers, but it's not necessary. Okay, so build theory. I'm using 2 tools, both with the purpose of proccing the bleed effect on the opponent. When the bleed does proc, you get a sizable amount of burst damage, so the idea is to make this happen as quick as possible and as often as possible. Even just the bleed build-up meter being on screen helps to make the opponent play more sloppy. It's just another thing for them to worry about, and it kind of passively works to your advantage, which is nice. I'm no expert when it comes to how best to do this. Luck scaling and how it affects bleed application is a bit confusing, and I've never really been sure the exact pros and cons between hollow and bleed infusions. I do believe that a hollow infusion on the Straightsword and using Karthus Rouge likely would have been stronger for base damage at least, but for this build I was really only focusing on the bleed buildup and not the raw damage. And in my experience with the build, the bleed does in fact seem to apply very quickly, with minimal swings from the Straightsword causing it, and the Bonewheel Shield weapon art nearly guaranteeing it. The shield provides a great way for you to avoid being parried by throwing in the occasional weapon art after some sword swings. It has some decent tracking, and great damage even when you do proc bleed with it. Of course, it does function as an actual shield as well, and I did make use of that a couple times. Sounds like a pretty great addition to a build in theory, but in reality, the weapon art has little to no hyper armor, very few frames near the end of the animation in which the block is active, surprisingly small range, and it consumes a massive amount of stamina. Using the weapon art from neutral hardly ever worked, spacing is difficult, and people just have so much time to interrupt it that it really did feel like a lose button. That leaves chaining it after sword swings as the best option, but it's super risky since it basically always leaves you at 0 stamina. Barbed Straightsword is what it is, a straight sword, and if you just stick to using it like that, can't really go wrong. But the Bonewheel Shield is really what spices up the build for me and makes it a bit more unique than other bleed builds. As for stats, again, I'm not exactly sure what the most optimal leveling would be between luck, strength, and dex, but this is what I went with for whatever it may be worth. Bit of a theme across most of my builds. Absorption is not nearly as optimal as it could be given the vitality, but I mean, come on, it's a pretty cool stylized setup for bleed at least. The how-to for this build is pretty simple. Making use of the straight sword's running attack and attempting to space your opponent with lights is the best way to start building up the bleed. When you have them expecting the straight sword attacks only, that gives you a chance to use the Bonewheel Shield. But certainly the best excuse you have to use that weapon art is when the enemy is looking for a parry. 2 straight sword swings into a bone wheel builds up a ton of bleed, and while risky, it's a super satisfying combo to land. For a quick review of the build, there's the big question of, is it good? And well, no, it's really not. Does it look cool? I sure think so at least, and at this point in my Dark Souls experience, cool factor and uniqueness are 2 of the most important things to me when it comes to picking up a new build. Like always, I'd love to hear your own fun or thematic builds in the comments. I do read them all, so if you have any ideas or feedback, it would be greatly appreciated. I do wish bleed was stronger in PvP, but while the meta might be set in stone for DS3, there's a whole lot of potential for bleed to be much stronger in Elden Ring, and that's something I'm super excited for and can't wait to test out. Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Build Series, and I'll see you next time.